The day my family erased me, it was raining just hard enough to make everyone hurry back to their cars, but not hard enough to wash away what they said. I remember standing beneath the gray sky outside the cemetery, watching people I had known my entire life avoid my eyes as if I were a stranger. My father had been buried less than an hour earlier. The flowers were still fresh. The soil over his grave had not even settled. And yet somehow, before the day was over, I would lose more than a parent. I would lose an entire family. My name is Evelyn Carter, and if you had asked anyone standing there that afternoon who mattered in our family, they would have pointed to my older brother, Richard. He stood near the black SUVs with his expensive overcoat and practiced smile, shaking hands, accepting condolences, acting like the unquestioned head of the Carter family. People respected him. Investors admired him. Even distant relatives treated him like royalty. No one noticed me standing alone at the edge of the gathering. Maybe they never had. As the last guests prepared to leave, Richard cleared his throat and called for everyone's attention. Conversations faded. Heads turned toward him. He waited until the silence felt deliberate. Then he looked directly at me. There was no sadness in his face. No grief. No hesitation. Just certainty. "Before everyone leaves," he said, loud enough for the entire family to hear, "there's something that needs to be made clear." My stomach tightened. Several relatives exchanged curious glances. Richard folded his hands in front of him. "Dad is gone. The family business is moving forward. And from this point on, Evelyn is no longer involved in any family matters." At first, I thought I had misunderstood him. The words sounded too cold to be real. Then my aunt lowered her eyes. My cousin stepped back. Nobody challenged him. Nobody laughed as though it were some terrible joke. Richard continued, "She has no role in the company. No role in family decisions. Frankly, she stopped being part of this family a long time ago." The silence that followed hurt more than his words. Because silence meant agreement. One by one, people avoided looking at me. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others seemed relieved that someone had finally said what they had been thinking for years. I searched their faces for support and found none. Not even from people who had once sat at my dinner table. Richard nodded toward the parking lot. "I think it's best if you leave." Just like that. No discussion. No explanation. No vote. After 47 years carrying the Carter name, I was dismissed with a single sentence. I could feel dozens of eyes waiting to see how I would react. Crying would have satisfied them. Arguing would have given Richard a scene. Instead, I simply looked at my father's grave one last time. Something inside me wanted to believe Dad would have stopped this if he were standing there. But he wasn't. And the people surrounding me had already chosen a side. So I turned and walked away. Behind me, conversations slowly resumed. Doors opened. Engines started. Life moved on. What none of them knew was that a letter written by my father was already making its way across the country. And hidden inside that letter was a truth powerful enough to destroy everything they believed about their fortune, their family, and the woman they had just thrown away. The next morning, I woke up expecting to feel angry, but what surprised me was how empty everything felt. For nearly 5 decades, the Carter family had been the center of my world. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone had revolved around the same people who had stood in silence while Richard erased me from their lives. I sat at the small kitchen table in my townhouse, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the streets of Hartford were beginning to fill with commuters heading to work. Inside, my phone remained silent. No messages. No apologies. No relatives checking to see how I was doing after losing my father. It was as if I had disappeared overnight. Around noon, I received a call from my cousin Melissa. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe she was reaching out because she felt guilty about what happened at the cemetery. Instead, her voice carried the same careful distance I had heard from everyone else. She explained that the family would be gathering at the Carter estate that evening for an informal meeting regarding future plans. Then she paused awkwardly before adding that Richard had asked her to make sure I understood I was not invited. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation before she could say anything more. What she did not realize was that her call told me everything I needed to know. Richard was not satisfied with humiliating me once. He wanted to make sure every member of the family understood the new order. That evening, while I sat alone at home, the rest of the family gathered inside the mansion where I had spent countless summers growing up. They filled the dining room, shared expensive meals, discussed business opportunities, and talked about the future as though nothing significant had happened. Richard sat at the head of the table where my father had always sat. Several relatives later described the atmosphere as optimistic. According to them, Richard spoke confidently about expansion plans, investments, and the next chapter of the Carter legacy. He assured everyone that stability was guaranteed and that the family fortune was stronger than ever. People nodded. Glasses were raised. Smiles returned. For the first time since the funeral, they felt secure. None of them knew that hundreds of miles away, a law office in Chicago had just received a sealed package bearing my father's signature. The package had been delivered by certified courier that afternoon and logged into evidence by a senior partner named Daniel Mercer. According to instructions attached to the envelope, it was not to be opened immediately. It was to remain sealed until a specific date only a few days away. Daniel had no idea why the instructions were so strict, but he followed them exactly. Meanwhile, Richard continued celebrating what he believed was his victory. He believed the family trusted him completely. He believed the past had been buried alongside our father. Most of all, he believed that removing me from the family had eliminated the last obstacle standing between him and absolute control. As the evening ended, relatives drove home feeling relieved that difficult times were behind them. They thought the story was over. They thought the future belonged to Richard. They had no way of knowing that my father had already set something into motion long before his funeral, and when the truth finally arrived, it would force every one of them to question everything they thought they knew about the Carter family. 3 days passed after the funeral, and during those 3 days, I heard almost nothing from anyone connected to the Carter family. The silence should have hurt, but in a strange way, it gave me clarity. For years I had convinced myself that loyalty mattered, that shared history mattered, that family bonds could survive misunderstandings and pride. Now I understood something different. The people who had turned their backs on me had not done it in a single afternoon. The funeral had simply revealed what had been true for a long time. On the 4th morning, I was watering flowers on my front porch when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something made me answer. A calm male voice introduced himself as Daniel Mercer from Mercer and Holloway Legal Group in Chicago. The name meant nothing to me. Before I could ask why he was calling, he asked a question that immediately caught my attention. Had I known that my father had left instructions for a private legal review following his death? I told him I had not. Daniel paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he explained that his firm had received a sealed package from my father several months earlier. According to the written instructions, specific family members were required to attend a formal reading scheduled for the following week. My name was first on the list. I stood silently on the porch as he continued. He explained that attendance was strongly recommended because the contents could affect family interests and existing arrangements. He would not tell me what was inside the package. He would only confirm that my father had personally signed every document and that the instructions were unusually detailed. After we ended the call, I sat down and stared at the flower bed for nearly 10 minutes. My father had never mentioned any package. During his final years, our conversations had become shorter and less frequent, largely because Richard controlled so much of what happened around him. Yet despite that distance, my father had apparently planned something important. The question was why. Later that same afternoon, Richard received a similar phone call. Unlike me, he did not respond with curiosity. He responded with irritation. According to what I would later learn, he immediately demanded copies of the documents and insisted that, as head of the family business, he had a right to know their contents in advance. Daniel refused. The instructions were clear. Nobody would see anything until the scheduled meeting. That answer did not sit well with Richard. For the first time since the funeral, something disrupted his confidence. He began calling relatives, trying to gather information. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had seen the package. Nobody could explain why an attorney from Chicago was suddenly involved. As the days moved closer to the meeting, speculation spread through the family. Some believed it was simply an additional letter from my father. Others assumed it involved personal keepsakes or charitable donations. Richard publicly dismissed the entire matter as a formality. Privately, however, he became increasingly restless. Because deep down, he understood a simple truth that everyone else overlooked. A man does not go through the trouble of creating secret legal instructions unless there is something important he intends to reveal. And whatever my father had chosen to hide, It had remained hidden until after he was gone. As the date of the meeting approached, I found myself thinking less about the future and more about the past. Memories I had spent years trying to ignore kept returning. 25 years earlier, the Carter family looked very different from the version people knew today. Back then, there were no luxury estates, no private investments, no articles praising the success of the Carter business empire. There was only a struggling manufacturing company drowning in debt and a father who was running out of options. I was 22 years old at the time, fresh out of college and trying to build a life of my own. Richard was already working alongside our father and loved presenting himself as the future of the company. From the outside, people assumed everything was fine. Inside the business, however, the situation was far worse than anyone realized. Sales had fallen for nearly 3 consecutive years. Major contracts had disappeared. Banks were becoming nervous. Vendors were demanding payment. Every month seemed to bring a new crisis. I still remember the evening my father showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. He looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled. His shoulders seemed heavier than I had ever seen. We sat at my small kitchen table, and for several minutes he said nothing. Then he admitted the truth. The company was weeks away from collapse. If something did not change quickly, the business would likely close its doors before the end of the year. Hearing those words shocked me. Growing up, I had always seen my father as someone who could solve any problem. That night, he looked like a man carrying more weight than he could bear. He explained that Richard had been working non-stop trying to save the company, but every solution created another problem. Investors were refusing meetings. Lenders wanted guarantees the family could not provide. The future looked bleak. Before leaving, my father asked if I had any ideas. At the time, I thought he simply wanted advice. I did not realize how desperate he truly was. Over the following months, I became more involved than anyone knew. I reviewed financial reports. I met with people quietly. I spent countless evenings studying numbers after finishing my own workday. The deeper I looked, the clearer the problem became. The company was not failing because of bad luck. It was failing because years of poor decisions had finally caught up with it. There was still a path forward, but it would require sacrifices nobody wanted to make. During that period, Richard rarely spoke to me about business matters. He considered me an outsider. In his mind, the company belonged to him and our father. My role was supposed to be limited to offering encouragement from a distance. What he never understood was that while he was focused on protecting his position, I was focused on finding a way to protect the family itself. Looking back now, I realized that those months changed everything. They set in motion events that would shape the next 25 years of our lives. Yet when people later told the story of how the Carter fortune survived, my name slowly disappeared from the narrative. Eventually, it was as though I had never been there at all. The breakthrough came 6 months after my father first sat at my kitchen table and admitted how serious the situation had become. By then, the company's financial condition had deteriorated even further. Several long-term clients had left. Credit lines were shrinking. Employees were beginning to worry about whether their paychecks would continue arriving. Every week seemed to bring another setback. One evening, my father asked me to meet him at a small diner outside the city. The moment I saw him walk through the door, I knew things had become critical. He looked older than he had only months earlier. We spoke for nearly 2 hours. During that conversation, he finally revealed numbers he had hidden from everyone else. The reality was worse than I imagined. The company was not months from failure. It was only weeks away. If immediate action was not taken, the Carter business would likely disappear before the end of the quarter. I remember driving home that night, unable to stop thinking about what would happen if everything collapsed. Hundreds of employees depended on those jobs. Vendors depended on those contracts. Entire families depended on the company surviving. At the time, I had recently built a successful consulting firm of my own. It was not a giant corporation, but it was growing quickly and represented years of hard work. It was my future. Over the next several days, I reviewed every possible option. The more I analyzed the situation, the more I realized there was only one solution capable of saving the business fast enough. The cost, however, would be enormous. When I finally met with my father again, I presented a proposal. I would liquidate a large portion of my company assets, redirect capital, and provide the funding necessary to stabilize the Carter business long enough for a restructuring plan to work. My father stared at me in disbelief. He asked the same question 3 different times, because he could not believe what he was hearing. Why would I risk everything I had built for a company that was not even mine? The answer seemed simple to me. Because it was family. Because I believed helping each other was what families were supposed to do. But I also had one condition. If I stepped forward, nobody could know where the money came from. Not Richard. Not the board. Not the extended family. Nobody. My father looked confused. Most people would have demanded recognition. I wanted the opposite. I had seen how pride and ego already influenced too many decisions inside the company. I did not want gratitude. I wanted results. After a long silence, my father agreed. Attorneys were brought in. Documents were prepared. Transfers were structured through legal channels designed to protect confidentiality. Within weeks, the company received the resources it desperately needed. Vendors stayed. Employees remained. Operations continued. Slowly, the crisis began to ease. Publicly, people praised my father and Richard for navigating the company through difficult times. Newspapers wrote articles about strong leadership. Industry analysts described the recovery as remarkable. I watched from a distance as the story spread. My father honored our agreement and never corrected anyone. Richard accepted the praise without question. Year after year, the company grew stronger. The fortune everyone enjoyed eventually emerged from that recovery. What nobody understood was that the foundation supporting all of it had been built during those quiet meetings years earlier, behind closed doors, through a promise that only my father and I knew existed. The morning of the legal meeting arrived with an uneasy sense of anticipation that seemed to follow everyone involved. The conference room occupied the top floor of a historic office building overlooking downtown Chicago. When I arrived, Daniel Mercer greeted me personally and escorted me inside. The room was already filling with familiar faces. Richard sat near the head of the long table, surrounded by relatives who had spent the past week treating him as the unquestioned leader of the family. Several people glanced at me as I entered. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked surprised that I had even attended. Nobody offered an apology. Nobody welcomed me. I took a seat near the far end of the table and waited. A few minutes later, Daniel entered carrying a sealed leather portfolio. The room grew quiet almost immediately. He explained that everything about the meeting would follow written instructions left by my father. No interruptions would be permitted. No documents would be distributed until the reading was complete. Richard immediately objected. He insisted that as head of the family business, he should review the material first. Daniel calmly informed him that the instructions specifically prohibited advance review by any family member. For the first time, I noticed genuine frustration crossing Richard's face. Once the room settled, Daniel opened the portfolio and removed a handwritten letter. The date at the top showed it had been written nearly a year before my father's death. Daniel began reading aloud. The opening paragraphs focused on family, legacy, and gratitude. Several relatives appeared relieved. It sounded exactly like the kind of farewell message they expected. Then the tone changed. My father wrote that certain truths had remained hidden for far too long, and that he could no longer leave the burden of those secrets behind. The room became noticeably still. Daniel continued reading. My father described the financial crisis that nearly destroyed the company 25 years earlier. He acknowledged mistakes that had pushed the business to the edge of collapse. He admitted that many public stories about the recovery were incomplete. Richard shifted in his chair. The confidence he had carried into the meeting seemed to weaken with every sentence. Then came the first revelation. My father stated clearly that the emergency funding responsible for saving the company had not originated from banks, investors, or executive leadership. It had come from a single family member who asked for complete confidentiality. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. Daniel paused briefly before reading the next line. My father identified that family member by name. Evelyn Carter. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Richard stared at the table as if he had not heard correctly. My father continued explaining that the financial support had allowed the company to survive long enough to rebuild. Without that assistance, the business would have failed. Hundreds of jobs would have disappeared. The Carter fortune would never have existed. I could see disbelief spreading across the room. People who had spent years repeating the same version of family history were suddenly hearing a completely different story. Yet the letter was not finished. Daniel turned another page and informed everyone that the remaining sections contained additional information my father considered even more important. At that moment, for the first time since the funeral, it became clear that the foundation beneath everything Richard believed he controlled was beginning to crack. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than any argument could have. My aunt was the first person to break eye contact with the table and look toward me. Her expression was not anger or disbelief anymore. It was confusion. The version of history she had repeated for decades had just been challenged by the one person none of us could question. My father. Richard finally leaned forward and cleared his throat. He attempted a small laugh and said there had to be some misunderstanding. According to him, everyone knew the recovery had come from a combination of restructuring efforts and leadership decisions. Daniel Mercer did not respond. Instead, he calmly continued reading. My father's letter explained that confidentiality had been my condition from the beginning. He wrote that I never asked for recognition, ownership, or public praise. He wrote that I only wanted the company to survive and the family to remain together. Hearing those words felt strange because they reminded me of promises made so long ago that I had nearly convinced myself they no longer mattered. Across the table, several relatives were visibly uncomfortable. They remembered the funeral. They remembered standing silently while Richard removed me from the family. Now they were being forced to compare that memory with the truth unfolding in front of them. Daniel turned another page. My father explained that he had intended to reveal the truth years earlier, but continued postponing the conversation because he feared it would divide the family. Ironically, the secret he had protected to preserve unity had eventually helped create the very division he wanted to avoid. Then the letter addressed Richard directly. My father wrote that leadership without humility was dangerous. He warned that believing one's own legend could become a trap. The room became even quieter. Richard's face tightened. He no longer looked confident. He looked like a man realizing that events were moving beyond his control. Then Daniel introduced the next document contained within the portfolio. It was a signed affidavit prepared years earlier. Attached to it were financial records, legal agreements, and transaction summaries documenting the transfer of funds that had kept the company alive. Every figure matched the story in my father's letter. Every signature had been verified. Every record had been preserved. This was no longer a family story or an emotional recollection. It was documented fact. One by one, relatives began examining copies placed in front of them. Some stared at the pages in disbelief. Others quietly shook their heads. My cousin Melissa looked as though she wanted to say something, but could not find the words. For the first time since entering the room, nobody was looking toward Richard for answers. They were looking at the evidence. Yet despite everything already revealed, Daniel informed us that the documents and letter represented only the first portion of my father's instructions. According to the file in front of him, there was a second matter requiring immediate review. He explained that my father considered it even more important than correcting the historical record. Several people exchanged nervous glances. Richard sat completely still. The confidence that had carried him through the funeral and the days afterward had almost entirely disappeared. And as Daniel reached for a separate sealed envelope hidden beneath the stack of documents, a feeling settled over the room that the biggest revelation had not happened yet. Daniel carefully opened the second envelope and removed several documents that appeared newer than the records already distributed around the room. The atmosphere changed immediately. Up until that point, everyone had been focused on correcting the past. Now it became clear that my father had also intended to influence the future. Daniel explained that approximately 10 years earlier, my father had established a private trust designed to protect the long-term stability of the Carter family assets. The trust held a significant percentage of company shares, investment accounts, real estate interests, and other financial holdings connected to the family's wealth. Several relatives nodded as though they already knew about the trust. Then Daniel clarified something none of them expected. While many people knew the trust existed, very few understood how it had been structured. According to the governing documents, the trust contained a special provision requested by my father and approved by every legal advisor involved in its creation. That provision was activated only under specific circumstances involving family exclusion, misrepresentation of historical ownership, or deliberate attempts to remove key beneficiaries from family participation. The room became silent once again. Richard leaned forward and asked what that had to do with anything being discussed. Daniel looked down at the document before answering. He explained that my father's letter, combined with the verified financial records presented earlier, established that I qualified as the original financial benefactor responsible for preserving the company during its most vulnerable period. Therefore, under the trust agreement, I was classified as a protected beneficiary with rights that could not be revoked by any individual family member. Several people immediately began flipping through their copies. Richard's expression hardened. Daniel continued. The trust specifically stated that if a protected beneficiary was intentionally excluded from family governance, publicly disowned, or denied participation through false representations regarding their contributions, control provisions would automatically change. Nobody interrupted him now. Every person in the room seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. Daniel then read the clause that my father had highlighted personally. Because the events following the funeral met the conditions outlined in the trust, voting authority connected to a substantial portion of the trust assets would immediately transfer away from the acting family representative and into a protective oversight structure. The acting family representative named in the document was Richard. The protective beneficiary named in the document was me. A stunned silence followed. Nobody seemed able to process the information. Richard stared at Daniel as though waiting for him to correct himself. The correction never came. The legal language was straightforward. My father had anticipated the possibility that family history might be manipulated after his death. He had anticipated that certain people might attempt to erase contributions that did not fit the narrative they preferred. Most importantly, he had anticipated that someone might try to push me out completely. The safeguards had been sitting quietly inside the trust for years. Richard finally spoke, but the confidence that once defined him was gone. He demanded to know whether this meant he had lost control. Daniel answered carefully. The trust remained intact. The company remained intact. However, authority over a large portion of the assets would no longer rest solely with him. The room fell silent once more. For the first time, everyone understood the full truth. The fortune they enjoyed had not only survived because of me decades earlier. Even now, its future had been shaped by protections my father created specifically because he feared what might happen if the truth was ever forgotten. When the meeting finally ended, nobody rushed toward the elevators. For several minutes, people remained seated as though standing up would somehow make the reality in front of them permanent. The documents had spoken more clearly than any argument ever could. The history of the Carter family was not what they believed. The fortune they enjoyed was not built by a single person. And the woman they had publicly pushed aside only days earlier had been carrying a truth that changed everything. One by one, relatives began approaching me. Some offered apologies. Others struggled to find the right words. My aunt admitted that she should have spoken up at the funeral. Melissa apologized for the phone call she had made on Richard's behalf. Several people claimed they never intended for things to go so far. I listened politely, but something inside me had changed. The problem was not that they had lacked information. The problem was that they had been willing to believe the worst about me without asking a single question. That realization was difficult to forget. Richard remained seated long after everyone else began moving around the room. For most of my life, I had known him as someone who always had an answer, always had a plan, always knew exactly what to say. Now he looked older than I had ever seen him. Eventually, he stood and walked toward me. The room became quiet again as people watched. Nobody knew what he would say. Neither did I. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I expected. He admitted that he had spent years believing his own version of events. He told me that after hearing the same story repeated over and over, he convinced himself it was true. He said he never imagined our father would leave behind evidence proving otherwise. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he apologized. Not for a business decision. Not for a disagreement. He apologized for treating me like someone who no longer belonged. I appreciated the honesty, but the apology arrived after a line had already been crossed. Some damage can be repaired. Some trust cannot be rebuilt so easily. I told him I did not hate him. In truth, I never had. Carrying resentment for 25 years would have exhausted me. What saddened me was something much simpler. He had spent decades protecting a legacy without understanding where that legacy truly came from. Before leaving, Daniel handed me the final page of my father's letter. It contained only a few sentences. My father wrote that wealth comes and goes, businesses rise and fall, and public recognition rarely lasts. What matters is character. What matters is how people treat one another when there is nothing to gain. He ended by saying that he hoped the truth would not divide the family, but remind them of what family was supposed to mean. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside into the Chicago sunlight and walked alone toward the street. My phone was already filling with messages from relatives who wanted to talk. For the first time in years, they saw me differently. Yet I felt no desire for revenge, no satisfaction in watching anyone feel embarrassed, and no need to prove anything further. The truth had already done all the work. As I looked up at the skyline, I thought about my father and the burden he had carried for so many years. In the end, he had not left behind a fortune. He had left behind a lesson. And the people who finally understood it were the same people who had almost lost everything by forgetting it.